to confront the British on the issue of religious freedom, and it predated other similar transnational efforts, such as the Khilafat movement, by over a decade. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty, let me introduce the population of Ceylon in 1905, as I can assume not everyone is familiar with it. So briefly, as per the 1901 census, Muslims form the fourth largest religious group after Buddhists, Hindus, and Christians. The Muslims themselves were diverse, with Moors, primarily Ceylon Moors, but also Indian Moors, forming the majority ethnic community and constituting around 92% of all Muslims at the time. It was only in the 1911 census that Ceylon Moors and Indian Moors were categorized as discrete ethnic groups. In 1901, in addition to Moors, there were Malays, Bohras, Maimans, and Afghans on the island as well. Because of the numerical preponderance of Moors, the term Muslim or Mohammedan were used interchangeably with Moors. So, for instance, on the Ceylon Legislative Council, the Mohammedan member in council was alternatively referred to as the Moor member. And Moors did indeed dominate Muslim representation at the time. As Qadri Ismail suggests, bourgeois Moors based in the southwest of the island more broadly dominated the Muslim social formation. And this particularity was reflected in the occupants of the Mohammedan seat in Legislative Council. Now, against the backdrop of a deepening Islamic revival that had its roots in the 1850s, by the 1880s, Ceylon Moors began to reimagine their origins in Ceylon as part of a concerted construction of identity. No doubt, partly a response to shifting and later hardening identities across other ethno-religious groups in Ceylon. And it was also at this time that Ceylon Moors began seeing themselves as members of a broader global community of Muslims, the Ummah. This emerging identity was then both global and local at the same time. Key features of this later period of Islamic revival included transnational actors providing spiritual and symbolic guidance to Muslims in Ceylon, and participation in religious pilgrimages. The revival was also closely associated with the introduction of Muslim schools providing English language education, while emphasizing the need to continue learning Arabic. This period also witnessed the birth of an Islamic printing press in Ceylon, with both Malays and Ceylon Moors producing community journals and newspapers. Meanwhile, numerous mosques were built as a testament of Muslims' religious devotion, but also growing financial success in trade. Most important to my discussion today was, however, the adoption of Islamic attire, and the fez in particular among Ceylon Moors. Curiously, it was through the presence of a foreigner, an Egyptian, who found himself forcefully exiled to Ceylon and became a crucial catalyst of revival in Ceylon, that the fez became a symbol of religious revival, especially among Ceylon Moors. So Orabi el-Misri, known respectfully in Ceylon as Arabi Pasha, was exiled by the British from Egypt following his failed revolt against the Khedive's government in 1882. Michael Laffan has an excellent chapter on the nationalist leadership provided by Arabi in challenging the Khedive, who was the Ottoman Sultan Caliph's viceroy in Egypt. The British, meanwhile, had major interests in Egypt, especially the Suez Canal. So Arabi was a colonel of the Egyptian army. He briefly served as Minister of War and was considered a nationalist leader by Egyptian officers, artisans, and religious reformers for challenging the Khedive's unpopular rule. Following months of simmering tensions and confrontations, fatal anti-European violence erupted in Alexandria in June 1882, triggering an invasion by the British to secure the position of the Khedive. Arabi, who had warned the British in explicitly pan-Islamic terms about a regional response to any intervention, was ultimately captured by the British in September 1883. Arabi was exiled in Ceylon between 1883 and 1901 as punishment for raising a quote-unquote rebellion, revealing how safe the British felt Ceylon to be. in terms of the Muslim threat on the island. Curiously, in his exile, Arabi underwent a volte-face, shifting from the lionized nationalist leader into a mild prisoner who was grateful to the British for sparing his life. His primary objective became receiving their permission to eventually return to his homeland. It was during this time that his presence galvanized the revival in Ceylon and set the imagined boundaries of the global religious community within which Moors could locate themselves. His exile to Ceylon even captured the imagination of British audiences and was given full-page coverage in the graphic. Two key features of the sketches are the women, covered entirely except for their eyes, so rarely captured on camera or in print during this period, and the fact that Arabi and his companion Tulba are the only ones wearing a fez among the variety of Islamic headgear pictured. Michael Laffan observes that within months of their arrivals, the exiles began falling out with one another. Yet I would argue that despite their internal squabbling, they presented something aspirational to those around them. Arabi was arguably one of the most important symbols around which the Islamic revival in Ceylon took place. He stressed the importance of an English language education for all Muslims in Ceylon, and together with Sidi Lebbe, used his privileged position to advocate for the introduction of a secular Western curriculum. The global and the local worked together effectively to advance Islamic revival. And during this period, the appearance of these Egyptians was mimicked by Ceylon's Moors through the adoption of the Ottoman fez cap, which the exiles regularly wore. Now, historically, Ceylon's Muslims had not manifested their Islamic beliefs through a particular type of dress. This is not to say they didn't wear other headgear before the fez. So poorer laborers wore the white skull cap, while wealthier traders appear to wear the surat topi, a tall brimless hat made of colorful silk that resembled a beehive. But the Egyptians' arrival represented a turning point. The superintendent of the census, Ponnambalam Arunachalam, wrote in his 1901 report, "The presence of Arabi Pasha and his fellow Egyptian exiles in Ceylon during the decade has had the effect of stirring up the Moorish community. But this has shown itself mostly in externals, the adoption of the dress of European Turks, etc." Significantly, it was the Ceylon Moor community, as opposed to Indian Moors, who adopted the fez, perhaps as a deliberate signaling of their foreignness or their origins further west, complementing long-standing 19th century efforts to trace Ceylon Moor ancestry back to 8th and 9th century Arab traders. Indian Moors, by contrast, appear to have worn colored turbans wound around their heads, even after the arrival of the Egyptians. Have a look at this painting of Mira Lebbe, the Indian Moor believed to have first built the Castle Hill Street Mosque in Kandy. On the right, a photograph of Muhammad Sirasteen associated with Ambagamur Road Mosque in Gampala, and in the middle, a postcard photograph of Thambi's shop, Kandy, where Indian Moors were prominent traders. Mira Lebbe, Muhammad Sirasteen, and presumably the two proprietors in the center of the postcard are each portrayed wearing a distinctive Indian headgear, a colored turban draped around their heads. Other men in the background of the postcard also appear to wear a turban, as opposed to a fez, while two men, including one with his back to us, towards the right, still seem to wear the surat topi. Now, the decision not to adopt the fez was as significant as the decision to wear it. Dressing, Meera Vikramasinghe observes, is as much a creative as a political act. Cloth, or in this case the fez, is, and I quote, critical in the representation and reproduction of society and forms a crucial link between social groups across space and through time, end quote. Elite Ceylon Moors, the southern male bourgeois traders who were geographically more proximate to Arabi, as opposed to Moor farmers concentrated in the eastern province of the island, appear to have predominantly worn the fez. Yet in spite of the Ottoman fez, which was known in Tamil as the Turki Toppi, the Turkish cap, only being adopted after the arrival of the exiles in 83 and being worn by a fairly select group of men, by 1905, it was considered an integral and inextricable part of Ceylon Moor identity. They called it their national headgear, something they considered authentically theirs, in contrast to other Muslims in Ceylon. So even among this select group of men, how and why was the fez adopted so swiftly? In terms of religious leadership, there was no single spiritual Islamic authority for Moors in Ceylon. Thus, the figure proclaimed Ottoman Sultan in 1876, Abdul Hamid II, who asserted the role of Caliph of Islam, attracted significant interest from Ceylon's Muslims during the late 19th century. You can see the Sultan in this image, pictured wearing the fez. Elite Malays too announced their supplication to the Sultan, reflecting the appeal of global Islamic leadership to minority Muslim communities in Ceylon. Ceylon Moors did not perceive themselves as Ottoman subjects. This is really important. They openly and repeatedly declared their loyalty to the British monarchy, to whom they owed their significantly improved trading positions in Ceylon. You see, before the British took over in Ceylon in 1796, the island was occupied first by the Portuguese for about 150 years and the Dutch for another 150 years. And during those successive colonial occupations, Muslims and Moors in particular were considered public enemy number one. This changed under the British. But in the Sultan, Ceylon Moors could perceive a transnational spiritual figurehead. The fez brought Ceylon Moors into a global fold of Sunni Muslims, connecting them with the Ottoman Emperor and enabling them to signal their membership in the global Ummah. The global political context was such that dual loyalties were permissible under British colonial rule. According to Jamil Aydin, the Caliph Sultan offered to encourage Muslim loyalty to the British Empire as long as the British supported Ottoman geopolitical interests and rule over diverse populations, including Christians in Anatolia and the Balkans. This alliance between Caliph and Crown and the openly dual loyalty of Ceylon Moors lasted up until the outbreak of the First World War. Now, in my exploration of the Fez incident, I want to highlight how Ceylon's Moors leveraged these dual loyalties, extended both to the British Crown and the Ottoman Emperor, in exchange for securing religious liberties from the British. So now we get to the really juicy part. The adoption of the Fez created a sense of national authenticity for Ceylon's Moors. So when in 1905, the colonial state attempted to deny recognition of this material representation of identity by prohibiting Moors from wearing the fez when appearing before the Supreme Court, Muslims more broadly responded with a show of strength. These actions reflected a new phase in the shaping of Ceylon Moor identity. It became politicized for the first time. In 1905, Chief Justice Charles Layard prohibited a Ceylon Moor advocate, MC Abdul Kader, from wearing the fez when making representations before the Supreme Court. Kader was the first Muslim in Ceylon to be made an advocate. On 2nd May 1905, Layard, the presiding Supreme Court judge, asked Kader to either remove his fez or uncover his feet as a mark of respect to the court or leave the court. It was considered disrespectful to cover both the feet and the head in court, and as removing shoes was less viable, the practice was to keep the head uncovered. The irony that Layard's statement was likely made as he donned the judge's wig should not escape us. Kader left the court and would not re-enter for the rest of the year. He and his co-religionists spent the next several months attempting to convince Layard and the other Supreme Court justices to permit the fez in court. Yet on 19 September 1905, the Supreme Court delivered a minute reiterating the prohibition of the fez in court, as it was, and here I quote, considered quite incongruous to the gown and bands without which they have no right of audience in the Supreme Court. The prohibition of the fez triggered a public outcry among Muslims. They feared this decision could affect their pre-existing ability to cover their heads with whatever headgear in the Ceylon Legislative Council, the municipal councils, in their roles as jurors and witnesses in the Supreme Court, in the other courts of justice, and in government departments. The prohibition was considered a deprivation of their religious rights. Sorry. On 31st December 1905, a mass meeting to discuss the fez question involving the greatest number of Muslim protesters during British colonial rule was held in Colombo in the grounds of the Maradana Mosque, pictured here. The proceedings of the mass meeting were published by the Fez Committee, which comprised elite representatives of various Muslim groups in Ceylon who led the campaign to overturn the Supreme Court's decision. Boras, who never wore the fez, as they wore their own distinct white and gold knitted caps, were also represented. The elite composition of the committee provides an insight into who the champions of an avowedly Muslim cause were. Such elites are likely to have played a dominant role in both constructing and representing the image of Muslims. The civic action the controversy engendered, albeit confined to men, as there were no women mentioned in any of the reports, galvanized Muslims from 16 out of the 25 districts in Ceylon in a spirit of protest and group consciousness. The absence of women may be explained by the fact that women did not wear the fez, but also reflects the general functioning of gender in public space among Ceylon's Muslim society at the time. According to English and Tamil newspapers and the Fez Committee report, over 30,000 men attended the meeting. This was over 10% of the Muslim population in Ceylon at the time, which according to the 1901 census stood at 246,000. A Times of Ceylon article published on 1st January 1906 called the gathering a monster meeting, referring to the clannish cohesion of Mohammedans on questions of their faith, on questions affecting it. The press recorded the presence of Turks, Persians, and men of African origin, suggesting transnational support from non-Ceylonese Muslims. The Fez proceedings were opened by W.M. Abdul Rahman, the Mohammedan member in the Legislative Council. This is a slightly later ethnographic drawing of Rahman and indeed other communal representatives in the council at the time. The meeting was concluded by ILM Abdulaziz on the right, the trustee of the Maradana Mosque, who cited support from advocates from other ethnic and religious groups in Ceylon and India. The main address at the meeting was delivered by a guest speaker who traveled from India to demonstrate the transnational importance of the Fez and the transnational nature of the revival and the spirit of protest it inspired. Now, writing in the 1830s, M.C.M. Khalil, whose work was then picked up by future scholars such as Vijaya Samaravira, condemned the decision to get a speaker from India. He saw this as evidence of the backwardness and illiteracy of the community, that they needed a foreigner to speak on their behalf. I would, however, disagree with this assessment and argue that, in fact, it was a highly strategic decision. You see, although the English publications at the time did not give much detail, the Tamil newspapers give a little more background detail about the speaker. And further research into the person of Maulavi Rafiuddin Ahmed suggested that he was by far the most high-profile Muslim dignitary to involve himself in the affairs of Ceylon's Muslims at the time. He was a former assistant of William, later Abdullah Quilliam, who established the first mosque in Britain. Quilliam and Rafiuddin successfully campaigned against the opening of the play Muhammad in London, as they considered it insulting to Islam. Rafiuddin was also a friend of Abdul Karim, the Munshi and trusted advisor of Queen Victoria, who introduced Rafiuddin to the Queen. The relationship between the Munshi and Queen Victoria, of course, was most recently reimagined by Ali Faisal alongside the immortal Judi Dench. In August 1892, Rafiuddin was invited to pay his respects to Sultan Abdul Hamid II in Turkey, accompanied by Sir Alfred Sandison of the British Embassy, who acted as interpreter. Rafiuddin then was no ordinary ally. He had audiences with two of the monarchs who ruled over the two empires to which Ceylon's Moors pledged their loyalties, and he had a track record of changing British minds on issues considered injurious to Muslims. Rafiuddin, an advocate himself, claimed he accepted the request to speak at the meeting for two reasons. First, Rafiuddin admitted that he was personally invited by his friend Karimji Jaffaji, one of the most prominent Bora traders in Ceylon at the time, and could not refuse his invitation. The crucial involvement of a Bora belonging to a minority Muslim ethnic group within Ceylon highlights the religious nature or Muslimness of the Fez incident. The second reason Rafiuddin cited was the, quote, confraternity of Islam and the bond of common citizenship of the British Empire. This perceived connectedness of Muslims within the British Empire was apparent elsewhere, including in India. Farida Zaman notes that by the late 19th century, contemporary Muslims appeared increasingly to be aware of, to reference, to be inspired by, and to decry the experiences of their co-religionists dwelling in other, sometimes far-flung parts of the Muslim world. While in daily affairs, Ceylon Moors remained largely aloof from their co-religionists in India, as they tended to stress their ethnic difference from Indian Muslims, there was room for alliance building when lobbying a common ruler. In his speech, Rafiuddin suggested that Muslim subjects' loyalty to the British was conditional and depended on the ability of Muslims to practice and manifest their religious beliefs, including wearing the fez. Rafiuddin cited the ability of Muslims in other parts of the British Empire, such as in India and in Egypt, to wear the fez in court. He next alluded to the alternative source of allegiance to whom some Muslims were pledged, the Ottoman Sultan. By invoking the Caliph of the Mohammedan world, who, quote, himself wears this headdress, end quote, he raised the possibility of appealing to another source of power, one that could potentially be a more significant threat to the British than Ceylon's Moors. This tactical invocation deliberately played on British fears of pan-Islamism during this period. Prior to and after the meeting, the Fez controversy garnered widespread public attention in Ceylon. And in the press, certain non-Muslim societies, which may have contained some Muslim membership, announced their support on the Fez question. In November 1905, the Ceylon Social Reform Society, primarily made up of Anglicized Sinhalese and Tamil elites, forwarded a resolution regarding their sympathetic position to the colonial secretary. However, apart from sharing letters of support from non-Muslims, the Fez committee did not invite the participation of non-Muslims at their meeting. Amir Ali cites this as a missed opportunity to turn a subnational religious identity issue into a national anti-colonial protest. Ali argues that the Muslim leadership's decision to not invite non-Muslims reflected the alienation of Muslims within the broader Ceylonese population. However, a national anti-colonial protest was not actually in the interests of the Muslim elites organizing the meeting. And in any case, such an anti-colonial protest may have triggered an unfavorable and possibly violent response from the state. Elsewhere, John Rogers notes that the Moors stayed aloof in terms of the Buddhist-led temperance movement in 1904, just the previous year. Buddhists may similarly have felt this protest did not concern them. This lack of interest on the part of both communities in separate instances suggests that ethno-religious competition frustrated any secular anti-colonial movement from developing. The organizers of the mass meeting resolved to send a motion signed by the Mohammedans of this island to the king in Britain via the governor of Ceylon. The memorial requested the withdrawal of the Supreme Court's minute, approval for Carter to wear the fez, and for the issuance of orders to preserve the rights of Muslims to wear their national headgear in courts and other places. The timing for the delivery of the memorial appears to have been neatly tied to Layard's retirement and departure from Ceylon. Layard left Ceylon on 8 March 1906. The memorial was delivered to the governor that same week, almost 2.5 months after the mass meeting. By 16th March, the Supreme Court amended its own minute, and Carter and future Muslim advocates were allowed to appear in the Supreme Court wearing the fez. The governor, meanwhile, informed the king that the grievance had been resolved locally. The Moors had succeeded in their campaign. The first major Moor-led collective action resisting British colonial governance had ended peacefully but favorably. It demonstrated the hardening of an ethno-religious identity steeped in transnational religious solidarity and represented the height of Islamic revival in Ceylon. As a postscript to the episode, there is a cruel irony in the way the Fez became associated with Moors during the 1915 anti-Moor pogrom, which was the most egregious episode of ethno-religious violence during that British colonial period. And it's highlighted in an incident related by Ponnambalam Ramanathan. Traveling with the Ceylon Moor Turkish consul, Muhammad Markan Markar, through riot-affected areas on 3rd June 1915, Ramanathan recalls, and here I quote, "On the way, the Turkish consul mentioned to me that as the fez cap he was then wearing might attract a stone to the head, he had borrowed an English hat and asked me whether he might wear it instead of the fez cap. Just then, a Sinhalese man going along the road with another Sinhalese exclaimed, 'Anna Hambaya, there goes a Hambaya,' and that is a pejorative term for Indian Moors. The consul lost no time in doffing the fez and donning the foreign hat." End quote. In the frenzy of the 1915 pogrom, the fez became an identity marker with which Moors could be singled out and victimized by other communities, both physically and verbally. And I'm going to stop there because I'm at my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shamara, for this very enlightening historical perspective. Now I invite Sehar to please come in, share her ideas, thoughts, and questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wettimuny, for the talk.
Shamara, please, everyone.
Okay. Thank you so much, Shamara, for the talk. I think it was interesting for me to know, to think about Islamic revivalism in a new frame, because as a person who has been interested in Islamic revivalism, I almost always thought of it in a lens of, let's say, how in contemporary scenario, how Saudi and Wahhabism has been taken aboard, and a lot of it also comes at the cost of one's own identity, one's own particularities, and it almost always comes at the cost of one's own culture. So thinking of Islamic revivalism in this stance was quite different for me, but it also made me think about how when you talked about the dual identity, and how you said that of course the Moors in Sri Lanka were had the dual identities, a with the Britishers as well as with the Ottomans. It made me wonder, a, did this dual relationship had any power dynamics associated to it? Was one identity more important than the other? And also the fact that what about the Moors relationships to Sri Lanka in and of itself? Does this continuous appropriation to the Arab identity not come at the cost of them being them almost implicitly acknowledging that they are outsiders to Sri Lanka, and hence that might also come at the cost of them being oppressed within their own land? So how do they manage these two entanglements?
Yeah, those are two excellent questions, Sehar. The first one was, one identity more powerful than the other. Firstly, I should say that obviously their kind of allegiance to this more regional Ottoman connected identity was much newer. So in that sense, I don't think one was more powerful than each other, but they were being strategically deployed at different times based on the different audiences or whatever events were going on. And there was a lot of activity organized by Ceylon Moors in terms of their global facing responsibilities as part of the Ummah, raising for the Red Crescent Society, when we're raising for the Hijaz Railway, sending money when Italy invaded, when there was a war in the Balkans and things like that. Then, they kind of asserted their more transnational identity, while when it came to local affairs, then certainly their Ceylon Moor identity was considered more important, especially vis-a-vis the Indian Moors, for example, because then they want to say, no, we are the authentic, we are the local, these guys are recent immigrants and foreign. And that comes to your really important second question about this did the appropriation of this Arab idea, or the attempted appropriation of an Arab identity, actually harm them in some way? And yes, I mean, it's not so much in this period, but first of all, but in the decades to come, and especially as we got closer to independence in the 1930s and the 1940s, it's very clear that the Ceylon Moors are actually having to very carefully negotiate just how foreign they stress, or these, how transnational and Arab their origins are, because there's a period of constitutional reform taking place, and claims to representation and power. And with that going on in the backdrop, and most importantly, citizenship acts being passed in 1948, 1949, at the cusp or just after independence by the post-colonial state, they need to assert that actually they are first and foremost Ceylonese. Because in 1948-49, those Indian Moors who I've been talking about lost citizenship, and were either rendered stateless, returned to India, or had to assimilate into a community that then stopped identifying as Moors but as Muslims, and the label of Ceylon Moor and Indian Moor sort of recedes, and Muslim replaces it. So yeah, very good questions. And it was all, it shifted, and the emphasis they placed on a particular identity depended on the political salience of the time, what was happening again in the rest of the country.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Just one final remark before we move on to I was also wondering, because I'm also researching on the colonial legacy of classification of Hindus into one category and Muslims into one category, and then I realized within India the classification was along the lines of religion, as opposed to Sri Lanka where it was along the lines of ethnicity. And then I wondered if Britishers would have had the similar role to play of the classification in Sri Lanka, or perhaps did they only reflect and not basically constructed the already existing ethnic distinctification.
Again, wonderful questions. So now I have to take you back a century to the 1830s, when the Ceylon Legislative Council was being established. And of course, it was along the lines of the Indian Legislative Council as well. And, it was established in 1833, and 3 members were meant to be local indigenous representatives. And they only appointed them in the end in 1835, 2 years delayed, partly because the British weren't quite sure along what lines to represent locals. And there's a very fascinating debate going on between the governor and Whitehall about, what is the most appropriate way to do it. Acknowledging that in India, religion had been foregrounded. Do they go along lines of caste? They actually put caste away, saying, no, that is that's too political. These high castes will never sit with low castes. So it's not that caste was not important. It was considered too contentious. They end up landing on what we call ethnicity today, but what they called race back then, replaced by used interchangeably with nationality, now more vaguely called ethnicity, for several reasons. One is that there were the communities, especially the Sinhalese and the Tamils, who were in fact distinctly aware of themselves as Sinhalese or Tamils, though it didn't necessarily mean what it means today. And this identity, especially the Sinhalese identity, became more and more politicized from the 19th century onwards. So in a sense, in response to the rigidification or the tightening of these classifications along ethnic lines and connecting it to political representation and political patronage, ethnicity was then more and more foregrounded, whereas in the past, prior to the 19th century, yes, they were aware of ethnicity and language and religion, but at different times, region was more important. Were they from the high up country or the low country, the maritime provinces, the Kenyan provinces? Caste and to do with occupation. Ethnicity then becomes a little more fixed as the category, and that was certainly down to the British. But the point is, they didn't construct that identity. They had, in some sense, long identified. They had these ethnic identities had long existed, though they came and receded in terms of significance at different times.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much, Sehar, for your questions. Now I open the floor to any questions from any participants that they might have. They can also type them in the chat box or unmute themselves and ask.
Uh, can I ask a question? Am I audible?
Yes, Sakshi, you're absolutely audible.
Great. Thank you so much, Shamara, for such an insightful talk. Thank you, Sehar, for your comments and keeping the discussion flowing. I just wanted to, ask if you could share more on the idea of allegiance with respect, so when you said that the Moors were more loyal towards the British, like their identity wise, they were more, instead of Ottomans, the loyalty lied more with the British crown. So, how do we say, how do we look at allegiance when it comes to, the colonial past and then the changing setups post-colonial, in the post-colonial era? So, how should we look at it? So, does that change, and how do we look at it in terms of the contemporary times and the with the perspective of this outsider gaze, the othering sort of gaze, where you feel that okay, so even the majoritarians would view them as if they had allegiance to another sort of set of uh, people or ideas. In that perspective, I just wanted to know more of how do we look at allegiance and identity coming together.
Yes, actually, thanks for your question. And this relates to what happened. I mentioned very briefly the 1915 anti-Moor pogrom. This really appalling 9 days of violence where Moors were targeted, and their homes, shops, mosques were destroyed, damaged, and looted on a mass scale. One of the reasons, one of the main reasons it broke out was over contestation over religious processions. Very common, even in India at the time. You have a Buddhist procession or perhaps a Hindu procession going past a mosque, and violence breaks out. But there was also a lot of economic grievances, especially amongst the majority community, the Sinhalese and the Moors, who were the primary traders on the island. Now, to take it back to their allegiance to the British, what happened in the early 19th century when the British took over is that they shifted their stance from one that was suspicious of Moors, especially Moor traders, in a mercantilist economic system. When there was a shift towards free trade, there was also a change in the way they looked at the local indigenous traders on the island. So the Portuguese, for example, and the Dutch before the British saw the Moors as their primary competitors on the island. The British, with this change in economic ethos in the early 19th century, actually said, hey, these guys are good for business. Let's encourage them to come over from India. Let's make freedom of movement for them easier around the country, because they'd been blocked from trading in certain parts. They'd been blocked from accumulating land and capital in certain commercial centers in Ceylon. The British liberalized a lot of that, and so there was very much a positive connection between Moor traders in particular and the British. Now, I'm speaking, I stress traders because actually the largest group of Moors were based in the Eastern Province and were farmers and don't really feature in this. As I said, even though the numbers are small, the kind of the Muslim social formation was dominated by these bourgeois traders in the southwest of the island, and those are who we're really talking about today. So there was considered, they acknowledged that their positions had greatly improved due to the British. The British were supportive of them, and they guaranteed enough religious freedom that they were allowed to worship, which again the Portuguese and the Dutch before had not allowed. So they lifted religious restrictions on all the local communities in some sense. As a result, as these Moors suddenly became more prosperous through the 19th century, they came into conflict with local communities, especially the majority community. This is not going to be something that's completely unfamiliar in the context of India as well, to some extent. And especially Sinhalese traders who, for example, were financing local vernacular newspapers, were probably encouraging a lot of vitriol and rhetoric in Sinhala vernacular press in 19th century, not just because they, disliked Muslims or had issues with their religious practices, but because they were in direct competition with each other and were finding that they were losing out in the marketplace very often. So it's economic grievance dressed up in the garb of religious difference and grievance. By the 1930s, so that's to paint a picture of that the kind of longer term relationship between Muslims and the state and Muslims and the majority community. Now, by the 1930s and 1940s, Ceylonese started pushing for greater self-government and eventually independence. But in contrast to India, remember, we had none of the bloodshed that took place here. In fact, Ceylon was portrayed somewhat inaccurately as a model colony for the British, especially because I think we are this small and much more manageable neighbor compared to India and what was going on there. So there was never any violence against the British. At no point was there bloodshed in that sense. And the British then, by the end of the 1930s, start realizing, okay, you know what, let's just give in to the Sinhalese demands. And in fact, people talk about divide and rule in Sri Lanka, but I don't think, in fact, Meera Wickramasinghe, a very respected Sri Lankan historian, says that divide and rule as a policy never really features in Ceylon under the British time, except maybe by the 20s and 30s, where the British are actually favoring the majority community rather than the minority community as we see in other colonial contexts, because they basically give in to Sinhalese demands about representation. Now, this really concerns the Tamil population, which is the largest minority population, and that it's in this period that we start seeing the roots and the origins of our ethnic conflict that followed in the post-colonial period. But the Muslims aren't really campaigning against the Sinhalese at this point. In fact, what happens is that they essentially switch their allegiance to some degree from the British to voting alongside, to saying, okay, we'll go along with the Sinhalese parties. And we don't have Muslim political parties. The very first Muslim political party that's established is only in the 1980s. Up until that point, they were party to the Sinhala political parties, and they were always given some degree of representation on a cabinet in these early post-colonial governments under the Sinhalese parties. They, in fact, stayed aloof from the Tamil political parties, and that's a whole other dynamic that I don't think we have time to go into today. But in some sense, there was a pragmatic strategizing amongst Muslim political elites that they would stand alongside the majority community. And that might, in some part, have to do with the quote-unquote horrendous lessons learned from 1915, where they were given such a beating by the majority community that they essentially didn't, I don't want to use the term, where they were too frightened, in a sense, to really challenge the majority community going forward. It's a very long-winded answer to your questions, actually.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wettimuny. I hope Sakshi's question has been answered fully. Now, if there are any other questions, they can be in the chat, typed down in the chat box. Okay, there is a question by Pratham. I will read it out for all the participants. Thank you so much for the talk. It was extremely interesting. I just had one question, somewhat related to Sakshi's. How has the post-colonial Sri Lankan state seen the Moors? How have they appeared, been represented in the nationalist imagination?
Yeah, excellent. This has shifted over time, especially in the last decade and a half, I would say. So, in the immediate post-colonial period, we saw the emergence of ethno-linguistic conflict for the first time, and it was really the Sinhalese majority pitted against the Tamil minority. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, we had a civil war from 1983 to 2009 between the Sri Lankan, essentially Sinhala state, backed by the majority of the sympathetic backing by much of the country against the Tamil minority and separatist groups like the LTTE. The Muslims were essentially working with the state in this. There was, in fact, in 1990, Muslims based in the northern province were expelled by the LTT from places like Jaffna, where they'd lived for many decades, if not over a century. So there was no love lost, in a sense, between the Muslim community and the Tamil community. And very often, for example, because Muslims were trilingual, the only trilingual community in the country, really, very often they would work with state intelligence services. They were hired by state intelligence to infiltrate the LTT and as part of counter-terrorist measures and things like that. But there were very few, although significant, episodes of anti-Muslim violence. We can count them on both our hands between the 70s and the 2000s. When the war ended in 2009, we see the emergence of ethno-religious conflict and discrimination on a major nationwide scale for the first time after the ethno-linguistic conflict had subsided. And so, in a sense, we're back to the period of similar to what we saw in the early 20th century. And now they've been, and to answer your question about how they've been represented in the nationalist imagination, currently, or say from 2013 till about 2022, so almost a decade, they suddenly took over as public enemy number one of the majority community, whom in a sense had militarily defeated the Tamil threat, but now saw new threats in terms of Muslims. And the tropes are very similar to what you see in terms of Islamophobic tropes in India as well. It has to do with Islamic practices, Islamic attire. There's criticism of, the othering of Muslims was taking place rampantly in social media, in the mainstream media, and also by the government. We saw several episodes of anti-Muslim violence starting in 2013, but really escalating between 2014 and 2019, where the state essentially stood aside while mobs attacked and looted Muslims. And we saw the state introduce very discriminatory policies, attempts to ban the hijab. During COVID-19, they had forced cremations, which of course hurt sentiments of Muslims who after the WHO said that burials are perfectly safe. So we saw a lot of anti-Muslim discrimination and violence in the last decade, which in some sense has subsided again in the last 3 years, as we've had a lot of political change and uprising since our people's struggle known as the Aragalaya took place in 2022, when there was a kind of shift in narrative about actually the enemy is no longer the minorities, it's the state and it's the establishment, and people talked about system change, and we had saw these mass protests on the road. They're only skin deep at the moment. I don't think we're certainly not at this point of kumbaya intercommunal love and harmony, but there was a shift that took place in 2009 and in 2022, and for the first time our presidential and parliamentary elections that took place in 2024 last year, for the first time ethnicity and religion were not talking points. It was about the campaigns were run on anti-corruption and system change and accountability. I don't think this is permanent. I think these communalist and ethnicized politicking is always a weapon to be wielded, and we will see it again. But it didn't appear in 2024, and that in itself was very significant. Yeah, sorry again, my answers are very long. Okay, you're
Oh,
welcome.
that's nice to get an in-depth understanding. I request anyone else to ask a question if they feel like it. Oh, okay. Nikita has a comment to make. I'll just read it out. Just a moment. It's not a question, just a comment. This has been a very presentation. I came in knowing nothing about the topic, but the way Shamara has led us into the historical context is very interesting. That's so good to
Very
know,
kind.
Nikita.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to hear.
It's very nice to get good feedback and also like critical feedback. We're good to that. So I don't think there are any more questions. Yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you so much, Dr. Shamara. This has been a very in-depth historical analysis about the emergence of a distinct Muslim identity and also the proliferation of anti-Semitic ideas about British rule that has been consistent in every colonial rule largely. So it was nice to get the proliferation of those ideas in the context of Ceylon. So thank you so much for your in-depth analysis. Thank you to Sehar for her ideas and her questions, and to the questions of yes, Sakshi also says that it has been a very insightful session, and clearly so. Thank you to all our participants, and we will hopefully see you next Saturday. And we also have a session on Thursday with Dr. Sudhir Satar about his upcoming book, and posters will be shared soon. So thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Shamara. Thank you, Sehar. Yeah, happy evening.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for joining on a Saturday afternoon. And thank you, Sehar.